us to a really good part of the conversation. And I started, the introductions out where I mentioned how so many of you over the past couple of years have been faced with having to resolve the tracking, measurement challenges, and what to do to help to keep your organization compliant relative to all of the data that we as marketers want, yet walking that fine line, for what keeps us and the organization compliant. And I know many of you went through that process, directly with your organizations and probably led the charge relative to what you would do and how you would handle it. So, and I know some that are joining us today are still in the throes of that. They haven't completely resolved or solved for that and are still potentially marketing and making decisions or marketing decisions without all of that information. And so, James, I think you make a good point there relative to not all things do everything, but the tracking and measurement and attribution for you all and those joining us on the line is mission critical to be able to really, prove out from an ROI perspective what's working and what's not, to be able to understand where to invest more, what channels are driving actual patient acquisition, where you are getting engagement with the content that you're creating, right? All of this is for you all in your positions is what drives the strategy, what drives the marketing plan. It's what really matters for where you're going to be putting your budget. So I'm curious, with so many marketers still in flux relative to knowing how important measurement and attribution, in particular, true attribution, is to their marketing efforts, yet still struggling with it. I'm curious if any of you can weigh in terms of where you found some success with that. If you're willing to share how far you've been able to come in your tracking and measurement strategy, if you have an attribution strategy, and if you're willing to share what tools you're using, and maybe even more so where you've found some success, either if your hands are still somewhat tied to have visibility into all of it, and or in the past when your hands were tied, how you were able to make sense of it and make somewhat confident marketing decisions when you didn't have all of the answers that you really wanted to know. So I'll turn it over to whoever on the panel wants to jump in on that.
So maybe I can start us off, and then I'm sure James and Aaron will have their point of view to share. So I'll use a reference point to Aaron's comment about the shiny new thing, which hopefully will just bridge us to this question. And that is, not just because you can, should you do something, right? And I think when it comes to the incredibly important allocation of dollars as it relates to the marketing and communications effort, we really, really need to be ensuring that every dollar we're spending is really going to be serving the organization in the best possible way. And I think that part of that journey for us really starts with having a very, very close and connected relationship with our financial team, with everything from the CFO through the organization. Understanding healthcare finances is unbelievably complicated, and I wouldn't for a moment suggest that I'm an expert in that space. Definitely lifelong student for sure, but I think really being able to understand how your business operates, no matter what vertical you're in, whether it's inpatient, outpatient, acute, or primary care, really understanding how you generate dollars for your system and how you can support that from a marketing perspective is of crucial importance, and really being able to establish baselines from the get-go around hard metrics, not soft metrics. Now, I think all metrics have a value, but I think that there's no question that we're having those more elevated conversations and ones that really are relying on the value that you're delivering. It's about really tying it to those hard goals that are established from the very beginning. So that idea of being able to really start with the end in mind and having that strategy very clearly laid out and really really understanding the business goals and the execution that would then inform the marketing process is really something, I think, to the point that Erin made, is that this isn't something that starts and stops. This is a continuous effort. So I would say that really being able to establish those metrics and make sure that there is a complete buy-in on those and what you're going to be doing, and then really allocating dollars to where you have capacity, where you have the ability to build that business. You know, I think that part of the challenge in healthcare is that oftentimes the most profitable areas are sometimes the most hard to access. And so that doesn't mean that you shouldn't give some attention, but it's a question of how much attention are you going to give and what can you have to show for it if you're going to be expending dollars in that space. I think also one of the other areas that really we need to kind of be lifting our heads outside of healthcare to look at is in other industries where they are looking at net promoter score and value of lifetime value for a customer. You know, these are terms that are relatively new to the healthcare space, and I would say that we really need to be leaning into those. Another point that I'll make is that we tend, in my experiences, to have focused on new patient acquisition, which is always important, right? You want to be growing your share, you want to be growing your slice of the pie, but let us not underestimate the value of retention and really holding on to that patient, to that customer that we have worked so hard and spent so much money to acquire. And I feel like there's tons of opportunity. We could probably have a whole webinar just on that subject around loyalty programs and really being able to truly establish that customer engagement. But I think that those are some of the areas that we should probably be looking at a little bit more if we haven't.
Yeah.
The question that I could pose to you maybe is tied to some of the points Salima was just making. Since you come, you know, from you have experiences in different verticals where it really truly is more of a consumer play. You know, any thoughts there to where Salima was going relative to also putting an emphasis and a focus on the loyalty and the retention, particularly where, you know, concierge medicine and retail medicine is becoming so prevalent and mainstream now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, one thought that really comes to mind that, you know, research is indicating that consumers really want somebody to quarterback their care for them, that they do often actually have a health system of choice, and they're looking for a PCP who is associated with a health system who can who knows how to navigate and get them to the right specialist when they need it. And I think a lot of health systems are starting to make this shift where you see them investing in primary care networks. You see them expanding to include NPs and APPs and physician directories and create, you know, messaging to help consumers understand that, you know, you might not need to see this doctor. Here's another professional who can get you the care you need, who's part of that office, who's part of our system. I think it's like two big shifts that I've seen happen just over the last couple of years in terms of consumers understanding what a nurse practitioner even is on a broader scale, and health systems being more welcoming to those roles. And those roles really they're the gateway to the health system. But then if somebody, you know, engages with specialized care, they might not need it again for years. And you want them to have that ongoing relationship with that primary care physician who will keep them in the system going forward. You know, and, you know, what does that mean for us and kind of our day to day? You know, I was in a meeting the other day and we were talking about speed to care being such an important variable. And in all of our marketing, especially if you're thinking about lifelong value and a lifelong relationship, our marketing is the first step in establishing trust. And whatever we market, we've got to deliver upon. And if we're marketing, right, primary care, and we actually don't have access to the primary care that we think, that's a problem. And it's usually more nuanced than we think. So one of the examples that came up in the meeting the other day was, sure, you can get with these primary care doctors, But if you're seeking this specific gender or this specific language, now you are out over our 3-month wait, or what that metric that we're shooting to overcome. And the marketing team needs to be in touch with that. And as we adjust and improve in the health system, we adjust our messaging to market properly and build that trust.
James, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think a lot of great points were made there. I was really resonating with what Aaron was saying because, again, it ties into everything from a data perspective. Had very similar challenges in terms of putting out, our marketing communications, our messaging, our campaigns, and then access, being an operational problem. Attracting those new patients. We talked, I think it was Salima who, said that the focus is largely on new patient acquisition, and that's true. And then to set that expectation for new patients that, that we've acquired, juxtaposed with, in terms of our marketing messaging, and then juxtaposed with waits or lack of access, outside that 3-month time frame, sometimes 3 to 6 months. It presents a challenge for us as marketers in that response. I think the alignment of data is so important. And going back to your original question, where you talked about some of the challenges stemming from initially privacy concerns, cookies, third-party data, and now moving forward, it's been a challenge to look at our technologies and understand what our data needs are, and how we can connect that data to have better data alignment. I think that's the thread here through everything that my fellow panelists have been saying. The challenges that we all face are again the acquisition of new technologies and the lead time to do so, the IT hurdles and security hurdles and privacy hurdles that we need to get through, the cost. But I will say, from our perspective, from my experience, making those decisions responsibly and getting buy-in, and that was said several times here, from our leaders, from our executive teams, that these technologies are aligned towards a plan, in terms of how we better communicate, better understand our consumers to patients, better understand our existing patients, be better equipped to spend that next marketing dollar, as Salima had said, to whether it's in new patient acquisition, whether it's in retention, or whether it's in reactivation. We found a strong play in reactivation of patients that have had significant downtime within our health system. So, we could probably, as Salima said, any one of these topics, any of these questions, I feel like we could have an entire webinar specifically on, what does our technology look like just in the data space, right? But and happy to answer any questions at the end of the discussion here if we want to get more deeper into that. But to fully answer the question originally, we've got the challenges of first-party data, and the need to really understand what our first-party data is, and how to bring that together so that it's actionable, because that's a strong play in the privacy realm, or the privacy landscape as it exists today. Understand what data we have, from a third-party perspective, and with the restrictions around it, and solving for those restrictions, as some of us are doing, and I'm sure some of the attendees here are still struggling with those challenges, but being able to solve for that from a privacy perspective, and then tying it all together, with an eye on hard metrics, as Salima said, so that we can look at taking that data, activating that data, and responsibly investing those next marketing dollars within campaigns or tactics or what have you that are going to be effective and measured against those KPIs. And I'll close with, I think that one of the things we have to be able to convince our organizations is to not be afraid to test as well. Like, yes, we want to be responsible with that next marketing dollar, but I think part of that responsibility is making a concerted effort to test our technologies and test our tactics and test our techniques so that we can see where we can grow into and how we can solve those problems. We And that's all tied together, right? The campaigns, the data, the attribution, the metrics. Very deep conversation we can have on that, but I think we need to be willing to test as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are great points. And a few things have surfaced here in terms of education and engagement. And I would say education and engagement really backs up into content. That's how you engage with the consumer. That's how you educate the community, right? Content has always been king. It's always been king for SEO. We've been preaching that for a long time, and you all, have had content partners and you have copywriters on your team that's producing different types of content. Social media has been a great outlet in terms of education, awareness, and engagement. So I'm curious, maybe Erin, I could pose this to you if you could give us maybe an example or of a circumstance situation where you've really been able to successfully engage with the consumer, help educate the community tied to something within your organization, either through written text content and or through social media and promoting content that way.
Sure. So, we're running campaigns right now. Open enrollment is underway out in California, and we're running campaigns very actively that explain what are the options for people in other, in other organizations to enroll, but to ensure that they can choose physicians who are part of our network. And it's been great. Like I said, my whole team is really new to North Bay, and we're all kind of really new to this being an approach that we hadn't seen that until we got to California. But thinking through the content and the messaging and how much education needs to be provided about the health plans themselves versus just which health plans include which kinds of providers and why, and how to funnel people towards the right selection has been a really great process for us internally to understanding some of these variables. And but it's been great in terms of producing this custom content.
Yeah, that's great. That's fantastic. Salima, I know you have a lot of experience with community events and community partnerships. Maybe you can speak a little bit to, how social media and or content really plays a role in terms of helping to make those community events and community partnerships successful and valuable.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that content is this insatiable beast, right, that we all have to contend with, and it is ever evolving. And so I'll just maybe piggyback on Erin's comments a little bit first, just before I directly answer that question, and that is just really being able to leverage, as we really become much more familiar with AI and being able to really think of it more as a plus than a versus or a replacement in any way. It's really thinking about this idea of scaling your vast content demands across so many different areas, utilizing really powerful tools and abilities, I think, in that case, to be able to keep up with both that sort of general need, the customized or personalized needs, and certainly the complex needs. So just one quick comment on that front. And then to go back to, engaging the community, I think to focus on social and the unbelievable ability it gives us to be able to really engage our communities, whether they're highly specialized and much more complex, or whether they're much more general and really more on that side of wellness. I think that being able to lean in to the metrics that we're receiving on the social side, and for that matter on any content, the metrics are vast across the board there, and I'm sure James and Erin can speak to that in more detail than I could specifically. But the idea of really understanding who's engaging, how often they're engaging, what they're engaging with, and what they're responding or not to. I think that this is a live two-way platform that we have to be able to connect with consumers, customers, in a way that we could never have done before, and making sure that we are doing that in a really intentional way and being responsive to it really, I think, makes the brand extremely authentic. It makes it very present. And more than anything, I think that we all know our customers and our consumers want to be heard, they want to be listened to, and they want to be able to really know that you're providing something of value to them, whether it's content or whether it's a service. So I would say that, I've had the experience, fortunately, of working alongside so many great individuals and really looking at all different aspects of healthcare from a specialty perspective. But the rules of the game tend to be the same in terms of how you operate to be able to really optimize and maximize the impact of what you're doing.
Yeah, so true. James, you brought up the point earlier about shifting to a zero-click landscape. And that certainly is a part of, I think, most marketing teams' minds right now, whether you're in the healthcare vertical or otherwise. And many organizations are starting to see declines. I wouldn't say vast